He started with $1, built an empire worth $60 million, lost it all in 12 months. And then, sitting alone on a cold warehouse floor, surrounded by empty shelves and broken dreams, he made the one decision that changed everything. This is not a story about money. This is a story about the moment a man decided that losing everything was not the end. It was the beginning. Every story you've ever heard about success is missing something. Not the struggle, not the sacrifice, not the sleepless nights. What's missing is the moment, that single, quiet, almost invisible moment where everything changed, where one decision, one conversation, one question divided a life into before and after. I've spent years collecting those moments, and every week I bring you one. This is Business AI Stories. Let's begin. Some people are born into success. James Monroe was not one of them. A 17-year-old boy stands outside a convenience store in the cold, turning a single crumpled dollar bill over and over in his hands. It's all he has, not just in his pocket, in his life. His father left when he was 9. His mother worked 2 jobs and still couldn't keep the lights on some nights. The neighborhood he grew up in had a way of swallowing people whole. It took his best friend at 16, his cousin at 18, and it was looking at James like it was hungry for more. But James had something the neighborhood hadn't counted on. He was obsessed with one question. Why do some people have everything and others have nothing? That night, standing in the cold with his dollar, he didn't buy food, he didn't buy warmth, he bought a notebook. And he wrote that question on the first page, then he went to work. Not a real job. James was too young for that, and too impatient. But the neighborhood had its own economy. He started small, carrying groceries for elderly neighbors, cleaning windshields at the gas station 2 blocks away, running errands for the corner store owner who was always too busy to leave his register. $1 here, 50 cents there. By the end of 2 weeks, he had $3.70. He stared at it on his bedroom floor like it was a map. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. It was a Tuesday morning when James Monroe met the person who would change everything. He almost didn't show up that day. Economics class was on the 3rd floor, and James had a habit of stopping at the 2nd floor and convincing himself that whatever was happening outside was more important than whatever was happening inside a classroom. But something that morning, boredom, cold weather, or maybe just fate, pushed him up the last flight of stairs. He walked in late. Every seat was taken except one, next to a girl he had never noticed before. Her name was Rachel. She didn't look up when he sat down, didn't acknowledge him. She was writing something in the margins of her textbook. Not notes. Something that looked more like a calculation. Numbers connected by arrows. Crossed out. Rewritten. James watched her for a moment. "What are you doing?" he whispered. She glanced at him sideways. "Figuring out why the example in this chapter is wrong." He looked at the textbook, then back at her. "Who does that?" She was sharp, direct, and completely unimpressed by him, which, for James, was new. Most people either pitied him or ignored him. Rachel did neither. She looked at him the way a mechanic looks at an engine, not with feeling, but with curiosity. 3 weeks later, she told him something that stuck. "You think differently," she said, "like you're always calculating something." "Maybe I am," he said. "Good," she replied. closing her textbook. Most people aren't calculating anything. That's why they stay exactly where they are. Grief does one of two things to a person. It either buries them or it ignites them. For James Monroe, the loss of his only real mentor, the one person who spoke to him without filter, did something sharp to his ambition. He stopped wasting time. He started obsessing over margins, systems, scale. He read every book he could find on business, not the motivational ones, the real ones, the ones written by people who had actually built something and lost it and built it again. Sam Walton built his first store at 26, was forced out of his own lease at 28, and came back stronger. James read that story 4 times. Howard Schultz grew up in a housing project in Brooklyn, watched his father get crushed by a system that didn't care about working men, and spent his entire career building a company that offered what his father never had: dignity at work. James read that story and felt something uncomfortably close to recognition. These weren't fairy tales. These were blueprints. At 22, James opened his first store, a small retail shop in a strip mall on the east side of Detroit. Second-hand furniture, discounted home goods, items he sourced from liquidation sales and resold at a margin. The sign above the door was crooked. The lighting inside was bad. The neighborhood wasn't exactly a shopping destination, but James was there every single day, before sunrise, and slowly, very slowly, people started coming. By 27, James had 3 stores. By 31, he had 11. By 35, he had 42 locations across 6 states, over 800 employees, and a brand that middle-class American families trusted for affordable home goods. The boy who once held a crumpled dollar bill in the Detroit cold was now sitting in board meetings, signing lease agreements, shaking hands with investors who wore watches that cost more than his first apartment. He had made it, or so he believed, because success, James would later say, has a dangerous side effect. It makes you stop being afraid. And fear, as it turns out, was the engine the whole time. He stopped writing in the notebook somewhere around store number 20. Stopped asking questions. Stopped calculating. The curiosity that had built everything quietly, without announcement, went to sleep. And James didn't notice. He was too busy. 2007, James Monroe is 40 years old. He has a beautiful home, a company worth $60 million, and a calendar so full he sometimes forgets to eat. What he doesn't have is that notebook. Somewhere in the back of his mind, in a room he'd stopped visiting, a small voice was saying something uncomfortable. "You're standing still, James. The world is not." He ignored it. He shouldn't have. Because while James was managing what he'd built, something was shifting beneath the surface of the entire economy. Consumer debt was at historic highs. The housing market was running on fiction. And the retail model he'd built his empire on, physical stores, fixed costs, location, 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 was about to be tested in a way no one in his position was fully prepared for. No one, except the people who were still asking questions. James had stopped asking questions. 2008, the financial crisis didn't knock on doors. It kicked them in. Within 6 months, consumer spending collapsed. Families stopped buying furniture. They stopped buying anything they didn't absolutely need. James watched his sales numbers fall like a stone dropped from a building, fast, clean, and with no mercy. Store after store began hemorrhaging money. He closed 5 locations in January, 4 more in March. His most trusted manager of 12 years, a man named David, who had been with him since store number 3, walked into his office one Tuesday morning, set his keys on the desk, and resigned without looking him in the eye. James didn't ask him to stay. He understood. By the end of 2008, James Monroe had gone from 42 stores to 19. By mid-2009, he was down to 7. He was sitting in the last surviving warehouse one night, alone, the lights humming overhead, boxes of unsold inventory stacked to the ceiling around him, and for the first time since he was 17 years old, he felt it again. That cold, that emptiness, that single-dollar bill feeling. He sat on the concrete floor, and he wept. Not for the money, not for the stores, for the notebook, for the version of himself that used to fill it. 3 days later, his phone rang. He almost didn't answer. It was Rachel. He hadn't spoken to her in over 15 years. She had built her own life, a career in technology consulting on the West Coast, deep in the emerging world of e-commerce, advising companies on how to sell to people who were spending more time online than in stores. She had heard, through someone who knew someone, that James was struggling. The conversation lasted 4 hours. She didn't offer sympathy. She didn't offer money. She offered him a question. "James," she said, somewhere around the 3rd hour, her voice exactly as he remembered it. No softness, no sentiment, just clarity. "When was the last time you asked yourself why someone would choose you, not out of convenience, but out of loyalty?" Silence. "That's your problem," she said. "You built stores. You never built a relationship." He knew she was right, not because it was a revelation, because it was something he had always known and had been too comfortable to face. "The companies that are winning right now," Rachel continued, "aren't winning on price. They're not winning on location. They're winning because their customers feel known, understood, like someone actually thought about them." She paused. "You used to think about people, James. It's how you built the first 10 stores. Somewhere along the way, you started thinking about numbers instead." Another pause. "Come back to the people." 2010. James Monroe closes his last physical store in April. Everyone around him sees it as the ending. James sees it as the beginning. With what little capital remained, and with Rachel now serving as his advisor from 3,000 miles away, James builds something new, not a store, not a chain, a platform, an early e-commerce experience for home goods, built around one idea that everyone in the industry considered too slow, too expensive, too impractical. Know your customer like a neighbor, not a transaction. Personalized recommendations, handwritten notes in shipments. A customer service team trained not to close tickets, but to solve problems. A return policy so generous that his accountant called it financially irresponsible. James kept it anyway. He hires a small team of 8 people. They work out of a converted garage in suburban Michigan. The hours are brutal. The uncertainty is suffocating. There are weeks where James isn't sure he can make payroll. But every morning, before anyone else arrives, he opens a notebook and he writes, "What does our customer fear? What do they need? How do we earn their trust today?" Same question, different decade. 2013. James Monroe's platform crosses 1 million registered users. The press calls it a comeback story. James calls it a correction, because comebacks, in his mind, implied that something had been taken from him, and nothing had been taken. He had simply stopped paying attention, stopped asking, stopped being curious about the people on the other side of the transaction. The million users weren't a comeback. They were a reminder. This is what happens when you actually listen. The team had grown from 8 people in a garage to 31 people in a real office, small, still, deliberately small. James had learned his lesson about growth for the sake of growth. Every new hire had to answer one question in their interview, not about experience, not about skills, but about people. Tell me about a time you made someone feel understood. Some candidates laughed. Some looked confused. The ones who had a real answer got the job. 2015 annual revenue hits $40 million. Entirely online, entirely without a single physical storefront. $40 million. The same number he had built the first time. With hundreds of employees, dozens of leases, years of overhead and logistics and complexity. This time, 31 people, 1 garage-turned office, and a return policy his accountant still called irresponsible. The same accountant sent him a bottle of whiskey with a note. "I was wrong. Congratulations." James kept the note. He drinks the whiskey alone, quietly, in the same garage where they started. He sits on the floor, not out of sentiment, but because the chair hadn't arrived yet. And he thinks about David, the manager who set his keys on the desk without looking him in the eye. He had tracked him down the year before, offered him his old role. David said no. He had started his own business. James smiled when he heard that. Genuinely, deeply smiled. Good, he thought. Good for him. 2018, he is acquired by a major retail conglomerate for a number that his 17-year-old self, standing in the cold with a crumpled dollar, could not have conceived of. At the press conference, a journalist asks him what the secret was. James is quiet for a moment. He thinks about the notebook, about Detroit, about David setting his keys on the desk, about the warehouse floor, about a woman who gave him $5 when he was 18, and a question when he needed it most. Then he smiles. "I lost everything," he says, "and I had a friend who asked me the right question at the right time." The journalist waits for more. "That's it?" she asks. James looks at her for a moment. "That's everything," he says quietly. Some answers he had learned are better kept in a notebook. James Monroe retired at 51, not because he lost ambition, because he finally understood it. He returned to Detroit quietly, far from the conferences, investors, and headlines that once filled his life. In a small building on the east side of the city, he started a foundation for teenagers from neighborhoods people usually gave up on too early. Not the perfect students, the difficult ones, the quiet ones, the ones always staring out the window like their mind was somewhere else, the ones who were calculating something. Every student received the same thing on their first day, a black notebook, and inside the cover, written in James's own handwriting, was a single question. Why do some people have everything and others have nothing? He never explained the question. He simply told them to keep asking it. Years later, one of the students stayed behind after class. A skinny, 17-year-old boy named Elijah. He placed his notebook on James's desk. "I think I've figured something out," he said quietly. James looked up. Elijah hesitated before speaking. "The people who have everything," he said slowly, "aren't always smarter, James stayed silent. They just learned the rules earlier. For a moment, James felt something strange move through him. Pride, fear, recognition. Because suddenly, he wasn't looking at a student anymore. He was looking at himself. James smiled faintly, then slid the notebook back across the desk. "Good," he said softly. "Now, write better rules." That night, long after everyone had gone home, James sat alone in the empty classroom. The city lights flickered outside the windows, Detroit humming in the distance, and for the first time in years, he opened his old notebook again. Some people are born into success. James Monroe built his. Every great business started with a moment no one believed in except one person, a moment of doubt, a moment of silence, a moment where everything could have gone the other way. You just heard one of those moments, and somewhere in these books behind me, there are hundreds more of those moments, stories that changed industries, decisions that built empires, failures that no one talks about, but everyone should hear. The next story is already waiting for you. Subscribe, because whoever shows up next, you don't want to miss them.